All right, everyone. Bear with me for these next couple of weeks. I have a bit of a cold, so I am very stuffed up. Forgive any coughing or sniffling or anything that might go on during this lecture. So essentially, this is the lecture for both weeks 9 and 10. So take your time going through this. I will not be creating a separate lecture for week 10. So this for the next couple of weeks, we'll be talking about narrative therapy. Okay, so narrative therapy is an approach that narrative therapists believe that families frequently construct negative, self-defeating, dead-ended narratives about their lives. So they exist of things like myths, excuses, negative self-blaming, reasons for feeling overwhelmed or inadequate or defeated, explanations and justifications for why they are unable to do things differently. So you can see here, very language based. It's about what the families are telling themselves. So, narrative theory asserts that to achieve change, people need to learn to consider alternate ways of examining the values, assumptions, and meanings of their lives and see how existing stories dominate their views of themselves and their problems. Uh, so ultimately, families create and internalize new stories. These are the goals of therapy. So they come in with these like self-defeating narratives, essentially. The goal is to learn and consider new narratives, new ways of being, and then the families will create and internalize these new stories, make new assumptions, and open themselves up to new possibilities. So in short, they rewrite their future story lines and actively change or reshape their lives. So the stories we develop about our lives shape or constitute our lives. So again, language is the key here in narrative, helping clients become more aware of those previously unrecognized but powerful internalized narratives that limit their lives, allows them to engage in reauthoring therapeutic conversations that seek to develop alternative life stories. So they come in with what's called a problem saturated narrative, and they leave with a reauthored story that is congruent with values, goals, and hopefully a little bit less burden. Okay, so some philosophical assumptions of this approach. Narrative therapists base their ideas in post structuralist philosophy. So feel free to review that from our lecture a couple weeks ago. But remember, thinking about post structuralist as like the largest kind of like Russian nesting doll or the largest covering system. So this is how society shapes the narratives that we ultimately internalize. Post-structuralists believe that it is useful to focus on contextualized meaning making rather than on universal truths or an all-encompassing reality. So very much in line with social constructivism, and post-structuralism is an approach within a postmodern philosophy. So, going over to the smaller pieces here, in this meaning focused approach, culture, language, and discourse are explored in terms of how they contribute to the experience and identity of people in context. So, with their social location, and taking in this larger societal messaging or societal norms, things like that. Proponents of post structuralism seek specific details of particular people's experiences. And then another assumption is that lives are valued in terms of how they embody expectations or uniqueness rather than how they fit general categories. This will make a little bit more sense when we talk about dominant discourses and local discourses. Okay, some more philosophical assumptions. Post-structuralism includes the assumption that since we are all part of culture, we can all be caught up by discourses, and therapists can undoubtedly reproduce these discourses in the therapy room without even recognizing it. So this is where person of the therapist work is really important for us to be doing as postmodern therapists, because we can be perpetuating um, these dominant discourses, we can be exacerbating the status quo or being complicit in the status quo. So for post-structuralists, no one is in a position to be an objective expert on someone else's experience. So hopefully that's been clear throughout this class. We are the expert of the process of therapy. The client is the expert of their lives. Just because we have a degree doesn't mean that we know better than our clients. So as members of a culture, we recognize that power influences the political context of people's lives, both in and out of the therapy room. So very similar to feminist. Narrative therapists work to expose discourses and power differentials that support problems and to work from a position of collaboration, recognizing clients as the privileged authors of their own story. So they're the first author of their story. Thinking about this in a publication form, they're the first author. You may be a second or third, some later author in there. They do the majority of the work. Okay, so more assumptions. Narrative therapists find Foucault, so Michel Foucault's notion of modern power helpful in working with problematic stories. Foucault contrasted traditional power, which comes from a central authority, something like a king, a pope, a president, or some such figure, and is enforced publicly and dramatically through things like executions, floggings, and the like, to a new, more subtle and pervasive type of power, which he called modern power. So the traditional coming from like a central location, modern power instead of coming from a central authority is carried through discourses. So through things like lobbying, advertising, participating in school boards, and 1,000 other means, the more privileged people in a society have more influence on its discourses. So this probably sounds very familiar given the political climate that we exist in and the way our government functions. All right, so some more philosophical underpinnings. Like I said, this is based on French social philosopher Michel Foucault. He devoted his life to exposing how various social discourses objectified and dehumanized marginalized groups. And Foucault influenced White, one of the creators of narrative, White and Epstein, to weave in the social constructionist belief that there are no absolute truths. And Foucault also believed that theories of normality, so what is considered normal, were used to perpetuate patterns of privilege and oppression. All right, so diving a little bit more into this approach. Just a nice, hopefully a helpful little table for you here about the primary philosophical foundations. So Foucault's philosophical writings, critical theory, social constructionism. In the counseling relationship, you are a co-editor or a co-author, so everything's very collaborative. The counseling process uses structured interventions, focuses on various forms of oppression. And in terms of political and social justice, these are issues that are regularly included in conversations. So in narrative therapy, it aims to separate the individual from the issue and externalize problems instead of internalizing them. So 4 principles of this approach: reality is socially constructed. Reality is influenced by and communicated through language. Having a narrative can help us organize and maintain our reality, and there is no objective reality or absolute truth. So some concepts for us here. Okay, so dominant discourses are culturally generated stories about how life should go that are used to coordinate social behavior, such as how married people should act, what happiness looks like, and how to be successful. So these are broad, taken for granted cultural stories, values, or truths that shape how people understand themselves and others. They often carry social, political, or institutional power and position some identities, behaviors, and experiences as normal, healthy, or good, while marginalizing others. So some characteristics of dominant discourses: they're widespread and normalized in society. They're often invisible or unquestioned. These are just the way things are. And they tend to constrain possibilities for people's lives. So they also organize social groups at all levels, large cultural groups, all the way down to individual, couple, and family stories about how life should go. So these are the shoulda, shoulds, uh, how you, yeah, these are just how you should be living. Um, they are described as dominant because they're foundational to how each of us behaves and evaluates our lives, yet we are rarely conscious of their impact or origin. So, some examples of dominant discourses. So, one on gender, that men should be strong and unemotional, women should be nurturing. In terms of success, you must be financially successful and have a high status career to be worthwhile. Family, a real family has a mother, father, and children living together under one roof. And mental health, depression means you are broken and need to be fixed. So these are some dominant discourses that you can see are like pretty problematic, pretty marginalizing. And then on the other side of this is local or alternative discourses. So these are smaller community or individually generated stories and meanings that arise from people's lived experiences, relationships, and cultural contexts. They may resist, complicate, or reframe dominant discourses. So, some characteristics are they're context specific and they're relational, they're grounded in lived experience, and they create alternative possibilities for meaning and identity. So, they occur in our heads, our closer relationships, and in marginalized, not mainstream communities. They have different goods and shoulds than dominant discourses. So, some examples: a community where extended family and neighbors co parent, challenging the dominant discourse of a nuclear family. A group of men who affirm vulnerability as strength, countering the dominant discourse of masculinity as emotional suppression. A survivor of depression saying, "My sadness reminds me that I deeply care about the people I've lost," reframing depression as connection rather than brokenness. Then an immigrant family defining success as collective well being and contribution to the community, not just individual financial achievement. Okay, so other components here: problem saturated stories or thin descriptions. So the story in which the problem, and this isn't problem, like I'm not doing this in terms of like to say this isn't an actual problem, like this fake problem. This is meant to really denote like subjectivity and relativity. Plays the leading role and the client plays a secondary role, generally that of the victim. So this is what a problem saturated story or a thin description is. So the therapist attends to ways the problem affects the client at an individual level. So things like health, emotions, thoughts, beliefs, identity, relationship with the divine, etc., and how it affects them at a relational level. So with significant others, parents, friends, coworkers, teachers, etc., as well as how it affects each of these significant others at a personal level. So you're understanding it at a personal level with a person in the terms of a relationship, and how it personally affects the other person that the client is in relationship with. While listening to a client's problem saturated story, the therapist listens closely for alternative endings and subplots in which the problem is less of a problem and the person is an effective agent in the story. These are called unique outcomes, which I will talk about right now. So, unique outcomes or sparkling events, these are stories or subplots in which the problem saturated story does not play out in its typical way. These are used to help clients create the lives they prefer and to develop a more full and accurate account of their and others' identities. So, for example, let's say you have a couple who comes to you and they're talking about how they always end up fighting over a specific topic, and that is their like problem saturated story, that they're like doomed to always fight about this thing, which then maybe denotes to them that they are maybe not meant for each other. Then you're going to be asking questions about how they've navigated this in the past. Has this always played out this way? Has there ever been a time when they have feel like they have navigated this more successfully, or have there been alternative outcomes to this? So this is where you're looking for these unique outcomes or sparkling events. Okay, so here is in not a linear fashion, the therapeutic process. So first, what you're going to be, well, I guess in the beginning, what you're wanting to be doing is meeting the person. So you're getting to know people separate from their problems by learning about them more holistically, like their hobbies, their values, everyday aspects of their lives. So right away, because clients usually come into therapy with a problem saturated narrative, so they're able to really talk about the problem and how it affects them. You're trying to prime them to see themselves as more than their problem, and ultimately starting to prime them to see themselves as separate from their problem. So you're priming the process of externalization. Then you're listening for the effects of dominant discourses and identifying times without the problem. So you're looking to see what are these societal messages that have really kind of boxed in the client to see themselves in a limited way, or that they can't live a certain way, or they shouldn't live a certain way, or should be living a certain way. Then you want to separate people from the problems. So this is externalizing and separating people from their problems to create space for new identities and life stories to emerge. So I'll be talking about externalization in more detail in a few slides. Broadly, it's people like can come into therapy seeing themselves as the problem. And what you want to do is like metaphorically pull this problem out and have them see it away from themselves. So instead of saying um I am, in some ways it's similar to the saying of like I am a mistake versus I made a mistake. So the goal is to have the person not see themselves as inherently the problem, but that there's this external force. So it's again very language based. So instead of saying something like I am depressed, that like I experience depression, that it's this thing that's not innate in me, that is unchangeable. It's this aspect of me that I have some agency over. Okay, so then enacting preferred narratives, you are identifying new ways to relate to problems that reduce their negative effects on the lives of all involved and to thicken their identity and problem stories. So this is going from these thin, like problem saturated stories or thin descriptions to what are called thick descriptions. And so one of the approaches that you use in narrative is called thickening the description. We'll talk about that in a few slides as well. So then you're solidifying toward the end of therapy, you're strengthening preferred stories and identities by having them witnessed by significant others in a person's lives. Okay, so some questions you could ask to meet the person. So seeing this person as more complex and rich than just their problems. So what do you do for fun? Do you have hobbies? What do you like about living here? What don't you like? Tell me about your friends and family. What is important to you in your life? What is a typical weekday like, weekend? So you're just wanting to get to know them as a human being and not just for the issues that they're bringing to therapy. Okay, so then separating people from problems. One of the taglines of narrative therapy is the person is not the problem is the problem. So this is really key to the externalization process. So once therapists have gotten to know the client apart from the problem and have a clear sense of who the client is as a person, they begin to meet the problem in a much similar way, keeping their identity separate. So I am Sarah. If I come in, I'm struggling with anxiety. They're not meeting anxious Sarah. They're meeting Sarah, and then they're going to meet anxiety. So when did the problem first enter your life? So you might say, when did anxiety first enter your life? What was going on with you then? What were your first impressions of the problem? Or in this case, what were your first impressions of anxiety? How have they changed? How has your relationship with anxiety or the problem evolved over time? Who else has been affected by the problem, or again, in this case, anxiety? So you're talking about the problem as a separate entity, so that the goal here is to build agency and to build a sense of the ability to influence the effects of this problem. Okay, so preferred narratives and identities, these are the goals of therapy here. So this involves increasing clients' sense of agency, the sense that they have influence they can influence the direction of their lives, that they're not these passive participants in their lives where things just happen to them, that they are active participants. So during the process of therapy, clients often redefine their preferred narrative to incorporate local knowledges or these local discourses and lessen the influence of dominant discourses. So they're lessening the influence of these messages of how I should live, what I should do. And then this process is often a gradual shift from make this problem go away to I want to create something beautiful, meaningful, great with my or our life or lives. So with my life or with our lives. So it goes from this like place of help me. I don't know what to do with this issue, or I don't know what to do with myself, to now I'm feeling a sense of agency to be able to create something that I want. Okay, so the concept of solidifying. Therapists, so in this process of solidifying toward the end of therapy, you can do things like write letters detailing a client's emerging story after sessions in lieu of doing case notes. This will depend on where you work. This may not be an option in like community-based um, or community mental health or something like that. In solidifying, what you're doing is emphasizing client agency. You're highlighting their agency in their lives, including small steps and becoming proactive. You take an observer position, so you clearly take the role of observing the change the client is making, citing specific concrete examples whenever possible. So whenever you see a unique outcome or something that rebelled against a dominant discourse or thickened their description of something, you're highlighting it. You're highlighting temporality. The time dimension is used to plot the emerging story, where clients began, where they are now, and where they're likely to go. So you're doing this to help the client see progress and also really emphasize their agency. So rather than propose singular interpretations, multiple meanings are entertained and encouraged. So very congruent with postmodernism, where there are multiple interpretations, multiple realities, so that they're not stuck in these rigid boxes. Um, and this is all done through retelling and having others witnessed and decentered sharing. So ultimately, what that means is like the client will share like their new narrative. Like it's something that they could literally, you could have like their loved ones attend like a graduation ceremony of therapy and they write like their new narrative and they express it. And so, what decentered sharing means is that other people who have witnessed this talk about um, how they experienced that narrative rather than sharing about themselves. So decentered is really like reflecting back what they heard the person share without making it about themselves or being like, I resonate with that because I had a similar experience. Like that's centered sharing. Okay, so facilitating in groups or in relational therapy, it helps to authenticate preferred narratives. So this is also something you could do in group therapy. Okay, so your positionality. You want to have a stance of optimism and hope always. Um, you are a co-author, a co-editor. You're walking alongside your clients, similar to collaborative language systems, similar to feminist. You are like an investigative reporter. You're looking for those sparkling moments, those unique outcomes. So, without proper position, the use of some of these techniques can be seen as manipulative. So, if you're like, let's talk about anxiety as separate from you, this was seems like a unique outcome. So you're really wanting to, like any other approach that we're covering this semester, you're really wanting to focus on the rapport so that there's buy-in from the client. You want to be sensitive to power dynamics related to taboo and difficult subjects. And you want to ask the client's permission before asking questions that are generally too taboo or that you anticipate will maybe bring up some discomfort in the client. Then you also want to situate their comments you want to situate your comments by revealing the source of the perspective that you're offering. So very similar to collaborative language system, emphasizing that this is only one perspective amongst others. And then you want to view client stories through a political lens. You're always positioning them these larger societal systems, particularly those stories that oppress people's lives, things like racism, sexism, gender or class bias, homophobia, transphobia. You're being very thoughtful about bringing those aspects into the conversation as well. So, techniques, I'm not going to read through each of these, but just giving you these 9 practices for you to be able to look through, potentially put on your model chart. But you can see that you're positioning collaboratively, externalizing the problem, you're excavating new outcomes, you're thickening the new plot, you're linking the past and extending it to the future, you are inviting outside witnesses. You use remembering practices. We'll talk about that in a little bit, and incorporation using literary means, and you're facilitating bringing it back practices. So, again, feel free to pause here, look at this slide, or grab this PowerPoint out of Google Drive and give it a read. Okay, so 5 narrative therapy techniques. I am going to pause this so I can blow my nose. Actually, I'm going to pause. Okay, I am back. Hopefully a little less stuffy sounding. Okay, so 5 narrative therapy techniques. The first is telling one story, a technique that involves retelling your own story to find new meaning in old experiences. The externalization technique. Again, we're going to talk about this in more detail in a little bit, but just priming you a little bit. Externalizing helps a person separate themselves from their problems, making it easier to change something that maybe isn't serving them very well. Deconstruction techniques. This technique involves breaking problems down into smaller, more specific issues that are easier to understand and address. Unique outcomes. It is meant to help a person see from a new, more positive perspective, broadening their view to see more of their own storyline, so thickening that description and focusing on one that doesn't include their most pervasive problems. And then existentialism is another component of narrative. So this is the belief that the world holds no inherent meaning and that we all must make our own meaning in life. Okay, so it's talking about thickening descriptions. Okay, so we talked about this problem saturated narrative or these thin descriptions. So in order to thicken descriptions, um, so thin descriptions are superficial, insubstantial descriptors of internal states such as what is normal or abnormal or functional or dysfunctional. So again, it's like really see it reduces a person to really just their problem. So adding new strands of identity to a problem saturated description okay, what thickening a description is adding new strands of identity to the problem saturated descriptions with which clients enter therapy. So when people begin to experience problems, they tend to notice only those events that fit the problem narrative. So it's like this lens that filters all of the information. Our goal is to help clients create more balanced descriptions of the events of their lives to enable clients to build more accurate and appreciative descriptions of themselves and others, helping clients build successful and enjoyable lives. Like I'm taken back to, I think it was an example used in an earlier presentation, but like my friend isn't calling me back because they're mad at me. Like that's my thin description of the event, and it's also like very problem saturated in terms of like me not being likable and things like that, or having a rift exist between myself and my friend. Like a thickened description would be that, the friend is maybe going through something, they've been very busy, that they forgot, that there are these other explanations that are considered so that the go-to isn't always like this personalized problem. Okay, some examples of questions you could use to thicken descriptions. How were you able to defy its prescription? So at this point, um, I think the at this point you are moving toward naming the problem. So for example, I'll go back to anxiety. So how were you able to defy anxiety's prescriptions? Given everything that anxiety has going for it, how did you protest against it pushing you around? How might you stand up to anxiety's pressure to get you busy again or refuse its requirements of you? So you can see, instead of saying, like, how are you able to um, manage your anxiety? Like, that's a pretty internalized way to look at it. All of these questions are meant to look at your issue as something separate from you, and also looking at the person as having agency. So, given everything that, again, in this example, anxiety has going for it, how do you protest against it when it's pushing you around? So, it's really building that agency, that empowerment within the person, that like you have the ability to influence this issue. Now I'm really trying to solidify that part of the narrative. Okay, so another component or technique within narrative is called mapping. So mapping the problem, when you are what you're wanting to do is mapping family members' influence on the problem. The therapist explores the extent to which they have been able to stand up to the problem's oppression. So, family members are encouraged to recognize their own competence. You can ask questions like, how have you been able to avoid making mistakes that most people with this similar problem usually make? Were there times in the recent past when this problem may have tried to get the better of you and you didn't let it? How did you do that? So, this mapping problem not only creates a sense of empathy and understanding between the therapist and the family, but is also meant to be an empowering experience for the family. Okay, so within mapping, you are mapping the influence of the problem first. And then you map the influence of the person. But here, this is when therapists inquire about how the problem has affected the lives of the client and any significant others. So at this stage, the therapist is expanding the reach of the problem beyond how the client thinks about it. You want to examine all the ways the problem has affected the client, them physically, emotionally, psychologically, how the client's identity story and what they tell themselves about their worth and who they are is affected by the problem, the client's closest relationships, how they're affected by the problem, other relationships in the client's life, like other friends, social groups, work, how that's affected by the problem, and then the health, identity, emotions, and other relationships of significant people in the client's life. So, how parents may pull away from the friends because they're embarrassed about their child's problem. And then I put in 12 questions in the notes of this, but I'll read a few of them here. It sounds as though the problem is part of your life now. Does the problem have an impact on the relationship with other family members? Are you accepting what the problem is doing? How would you prefer things to be? So these are just some examples of that. And then mapping the influence of the person. So this begins the externalization process more explicitly. This phase of questioning should immediately follow mapping the influence of the problem, and this involves identifying how the person has affected the life of the problem. So here are some examples here. When have the persons involved kept the problem from affecting their mood and how they value themselves as people? When have the people involved kept the problem from allowing them to enjoy special and or causal relationships or casual relationships in their lives? When have people involved kept the problem from interrupting their work or school lives? And when have the people involved been able to keep the problem from taking over when it was starting? Okay, so all of this is leading to externalizing. So this is the presumption that the person is separate from the problem and that the person has a two-way relationship with the problem. It affects them and they affect it. So it is separate from the person. So here are some general externalizing questions. What shall we call this problem? What name do you want to give it? How did this problem come into your life? What does it require of you? What influence does a problem have on your life? What influence do you have on the life of the problem? What conclusions have you drawn about your life because of this problem? How does it intend for your life? Or sorry, what does it intend for your life? And is that the same thing that you intend for your life? So here's some example questions specifically about blame. So again, you can read these. You'll have access to this PowerPoint, but these are just more specific about a specific issue, which is blame. Okay, why should we externalize problems? Externalizing establishes a context where people experience themselves as separate from the problem, where the problem no longer speaks to them of their identity or the truth about themselves. So, again, building agency, building resilience, building empowerment. Like I said, the tagline, the person or the problem is the problem, the person is not the problem. People's own knowledge is foregrounded. People become the expert in their own lives. So, this is a result of externalizing. The effects of labeling and pathologizing are diminished. Externalizing reduces guilt and blame, yet leaves room for responsibility. Again, accountability and influence. Externalizing creates space for people to have a view or position in relation to the problem and creates ways for people to take action as opposed to being overwhelmed by the problem. So instead of, again, believing that I am inherently or innately a problem, I am looking at this problem and feeling as though I have some control over it. I have some influence, and I don't have to be controlled by this problem. Externalizing creates space for people to join around problems and their effects. So, if this is an issue in a relationship, it allows for the people within the relationship to like team up against the problem. That's a technique within emotionally focused therapy. Externalizing makes visible the politics and context of people's experiences and meaning making. Okay, so what kind of things can be externalized? All kinds of stuff. Feelings, thoughts, phenomena, practices of self, cultural practices, expressions, tactic, forces, skills, hopes, visions, memories, anything you can think of. There's just, some examples here. But really, you can externalize basically anything. Okay, so problem deconstruction. Deconstructive listening and questions, also called unpacking in narrative therapy. So, deconstruction points out that one's reality and the language one uses in engaging with that reality, so the reality of themselves, are not mutually authorizing. So, what that means is that the reality that you are experiencing and the language that you use to explain that reality don't necessarily mean that they are in step. Um, and it does not have to mean that they're mutually authorizing or that they reinforce one another. So, again, this is identifying the power of language so that, like, there is this reality that, like, so I'll give you an example here. Let's say that my husband and I are traveling and we both miss a flight. I might say something like, "Oh my gosh, our um, our trip is ruined. Um, and then I'll be talking about how all the ways in which this is like such an inconvenience and all of our plans are ruined and like this trip is just a throwaway." Okay, so my husband missed the same flight and he says, "Oh, this is an opportunity for us to explore this city. We get to spend the night here. It'll be like this fun adventure on our way to our final destination or something." So these are two very similar realities, and the language that we use to describe them very much influences our experience of them. That does not mean that like that language can't be changed to describe it in a different way. So all about shifting perspective here. So some deconstructive questions you could ask. Sorry, what are deconstructive questions? These help clients to further unpack or, you know, uh, get granular, explore, investigate. These are other words for unpack their stories and how to see how they have been constructed, identifying the influence of dominant and local discourses. So deconstructive questions also are about the history of their relationship with a problematic belief, practice, feeling, or attitude. So when and where did you first encounter the problem? The contextual influences, the problematic belief, practice, feeling, or attitude. What is it most likely, or when is it this problem most likely to be present? The effects or results of the problematic belief, practice, feeling, or attitude. What effects has this had on you and your relationships? So, like in the example I gave, I could be seen as like very pessimistic and like a naysayer. And that could maybe be an aspect that is not as appealing within our relationship. So the interrelationship with other practices, beliefs, attitudes, and feelings, are there other problems that feed this problem? So in this case, it may be like a desire for perfectionism, a problem with adaptation or adjusting. In my airport example, tactics and strategies used by the problem belief, practice, feeling, or attitude. How does it go about influencing you? So you're just wanting to understand this issue on a more granular level. All right, so alongside deconstructive questions is deconstructive listening. So as you're listening to the client's stories, you are listening for gaps in their understanding and asking them to fill in the details or having them explain the ambiguities in their stories. So let's say that you're noticing they're making assumptions about other people. Instead of just saying like, oh, these are assumptions they're making, you want to pause them and really explore these assumptions, how they learned them, how they came to apply them. So you're really trying to have them be more aware of their own process and how that things like assumptions or these, again, taken for granted truths are potentially negatively affecting them. So we use the concept of deconstruction when we remind clients that the dominance of one meaning or one set of assumptions is an illusion. So again, these assumptions are an illusion, and that is possible to apply a multitude of meanings and assumptions in understanding the same event or experience. So again, if I'm talking to my therapist and I'm saying, my best friend hasn't called me back, I'm confident she's mad at me, like that's the only explanation. So I'm, as the therapist, going to ask questions like, what else could be going on? It sounds like this is a quite distressing conclusion that you've come to. What are some other conclusions? Or what are some other reasons as to that some other theories that we could play around with as to what's an explanation for what you're experiencing? Okay. So then restorying is one of the final components of the narrative approach. So here's some questions you could ask to restory. Have there been times in which the problem was threatening to take control of you, but it didn't? When the problem asked you to participate in it, were you able to decline the invitation? How did you do that? Are there times when you simply don't fall for the tricks of the problem and you're able to take a stand against it? What facts or events are in your life that contradict the problem's effects on you and your relationship? Was there ever a time when you refused to submit to the demands of the problem? So, again, really trying to build agency here and to see the problem in a different way to tell a different story. Okay. So, some questions you can use throughout treatment. Hopefully you can see this okay. Let me move that a little bit. Well, I guess, okay. So in enabling openings, can you describe the last time you managed to get free of the problem for a couple of minutes? What was the first thing you noticed in those few minutes? What was the next thing? Okay, linking openings to preferred experience. What would you like more minutes, or would you like more minutes like these in your life? You're moving from openings to alternative story development. What were each of you thinking, feeling, doing, wishing, imagining during those first few moments? Broadening the viewpoint. What might your friend have noticed about you if she had met you with those few moments? So instead of the broadening the viewpoint is bringing metaphorically other people into the room, like, what would your best friend notice about you if this problem weren't affecting you? What might your colleague notice about you? So you're trying to broaden the client's perspective to see ways in which they act and are affected by the problem. So exploring landscapes of action, how did you achieve that? How did Tim, like, maybe another person that's in the system, help you with that? So trying to really encourage collaboration and teamwork, exploring landscapes of consciousness. What have you learned about what you can manage from those first few moments? Linking with exceptions in the past. Tell me about times when you have managed to achieve a similar few moments in the past. You also want to build off of past successes. So if it's happened before, it is likely that they can replicate that again. Linking exceptions from the past to the present. When you think about those times in the past when you've achieved this, how might this alter your view of the problem now? And then linking exceptions from the past to the future. Thinking about this now, what do you expect to do next? So just some, because narrative is so language based, I want to equip you with some like unique questions, because as you can see, these are a specific way of asking questions. So what I want to finish our like my presentation with you is on with a vignette and maybe a way to, and I'm wanting to have you see each of these aspects in action. So Daniel, his family, and the problem failure. So Daniel is 22. He's a college student. You're seeing him, his mother, Angela, and his younger sister, Sophia, who is 15. The presenting problem or the concern is that Daniel's parents describe him as unmotivated and withdrawing. Daniel says, I'm just a failure. His mom feels she has lost connection with him, and Sophia notices tension in the room. I guess in this case vignette, we're just going to overlook the fact that dad is not here. Maybe he's busy. Okay, so first, we're going to look at how you might externalize the problem. So, the therapist might say something like, when you say I'm a failure, it sounds like failure has been talking loudly in your life. Would it be okay if we called it the failure voice so we can look at it together? So Daniel endorses that. Then the therapist opens up some conversation to the family. So rather than Daniel being the problem, it sounds like the failure voice has been creating trouble for this family. And the purpose of this is to move the problem from Daniel, because it sounds as though he's been the IP or the identified patient, onto an externalized figure that all family members can respond to. So again, some questions that you could ask here for externalizing is, if we gave this problem a name, what might fit? When you say failure, it sounds like something that comes to visit you. Would it be okay if we called it the failure voice so we can all look at it together? How does the failure voice speak to you, Daniel? What words does it use? Angela and Sophia, when the failure voice shows up in Daniel's life, how do you notice it? So it's just some examples here. Okay, mapping the influence of the problem. So you might say to the mom, where have you seen the failure voice show up between you and Daniel? So Angela might say something like, when he avoids talking to us, I think it's because of that voice telling him he's not good enough. So then you can direct a question to Sophia. What do you notice when the failure voice is in the room? Then Sophia says, Daniel just goes quiet and that I don't want to bother him, but I miss him. So the purpose of these questions and mapping the influence of the problem is to highlight how the problem affects the whole system relationally. So some other questions you could ask here is, Daniel, where in your life is the failure voice the loudest? Maybe at home, at school, with friends. Angela, how has the failure voice affected the way you and Daniel relate? Sophia, what changes do you see in Daniel when the failure voice is around? Okay, mapping the influence of the people. So to Daniel, you might ask something like, are there times when you've managed to quiet the failure voice, even for a bit? He says, when I play soccer, it's not about being perfect, it's about teamwork. So the therapist to mom says, have you seen moments where Daniel doesn't seem captured by the failure voice? Mom says, yes, when he helps Sophia with her homework, he's so patient and encouraging then. So the purpose here is to surface families witnessing of Daniel's strengths. Other questions you could ask. Are there times when you've managed to quiet the failure voice, even just for a little while? Angela, have you seen moments when Daniel is not so influenced by the failure voice? What stands out to you? Sophia, can you remember a time when you felt your brother was really present with you despite the failure voice? Okay. Identifying unique outcomes. So to Daniel, you might say something like, what does it say about you that you can support your sister so patiently? Daniel said, I guess I care about her and I don't want her to feel alone like I do. And then so to Sophia, the therapist says, when Daniel helps you, what does it mean to you? Sophia responds, it means he believes I'm smart enough to figure it out. I feel closer to him. Purpose here is to strengthen alternative story threads that Daniel is caring and dependable. So other questions that you could ask, when you play soccer, you said the failure voice is quieter. What do you think makes that possible? When you helped Sophia with her homework, what did that show about the kind of brother you want to be? And then Angela, what do you notice about Daniel when he's encouraging Sophia like that? Okay, thickening the alternative story. So to the family, you say, it sounds like Daniel values dependability and teamwork, and Sophia experiences him as encouraging and close. What other times have you seen this? What other times have you seen this, Daniel? Have you seen this, Daniel? And the one who values connection. And Angela says, when my mother was sick, Daniel was the one who kept checking in on me. He didn't let me carry it alone. So the purpose here is to expand the alternative identity across family contexts. Other questions you could ask. Daniel, what does it say about your values that you encourage your sister rather than criticize her? How does being dependable on the soccer field connect with that kind of person you'd like to be in your family? Angela, how do you feel when you see this side of Daniel? What part of him does it fit with? Okay, then remembering. So if your grandmother were still here, what would she say about the way Daniel supported you when she was ill? And Angela says she would have been so proud of him. The purpose of this is to bring the voice of another important figure, reinforcing the family's alternative storyline. So if your grandmother could see how you supported your mom when she was sick, what would she say about you? Sophia, if your future self could look back at your relationship with Daniel, what moments do you hope you'll remember? Angela, who in your family history would have admired Daniel's caring nature? Okay, exploring dominant and local discourses. So, to Daniel, the failure voice seems connected to ideas about success. Where do you think it picked those up? So, Daniel says, Dad always says, if you're not the best, you're nothing. I think that's stuck. So, the therapist says, that's a powerful message. And yet, this family seems to value something else: dependability, teamwork, encouragement. What do you think about those values as measures of success? So the purpose here is it contrasts a dominant discourse of perfectionism with the family's local discourse of relational care. So other questions you could ask here. What cultural or familial ideas keep the failure voice alive? What alternative values does this family already practice? Daniel, where do you think the failure voice learned to measure worth by being the best? Angela, were those ideas of perfection something you also grew up with? As a family, I hear another value emerging or other values emerging: teamwork, dependability, care. How do those values show up in your daily lives? Okay, so documenting the alternative story. The therapist, you could draft a family certificate after session. So you could say something like, this certificate recognizes Daniel and his family for noticing that the failure voice is not the truth of who Daniel is. Together, they witnessed him as dependable, encouraging, and connected, especially when playing soccer, supporting Sophia, and caring for Angela during hard times. The purpose of this is to solidify a new family narrative in a tangible form. So you might say something like to the family, if I wrote a certificate about what we discovered today, that Daniel is dependable, encouraging, and relational, What words should I include to make sure it's true to your family's experience? Another question you could ask, what would you like me to write a would you like me to write a letter that celebrates how you are all pushing back against the failure voice together? And then finally, in our vignette, the definitional ceremony. So, in a later session, the family invites a trusted uncle who has been a mentor to Daniel to join. They share their certificate and their new story of Daniel as dependable and relational. The uncle reflects on how he too has seen these qualities. So, public witnessing thickens the alternative story beyond the therapy room. Um, so, other things you could say or ask, if your uncle joined us and heard about your care for your sister and your mom, what do you think he would say? What would it mean to you, Daniel, if to have family members reflect back what they see in you, not the failure story, but the dependable caring story? Sophia, if you told one of your friends about the kind of brother Daniel is becoming, what would you want them to know? So just some information for you on narrative therapy. So again, take your time. Well, you've reached the end, so you don't need to, I don't need to tell you that now, but I hope you learned something.